And now I'll move on and introduce our second keynote here in this session. That's Jermaine Halegwa. She's the John D. Evans Development Professor and Associate Professor of Communication and Media at the University of Michigan. She's also recently changed her affiliation. She was previously at the University of Kansas at the Department of Film and Media Studies. And we're very happy to have Germaine here, not least because of her insistence on sort of focusing on place and the placing in relation to the smart city. Especially we're thinking here, of course, of her book on the digital city, media and the social production of place from 2020, but also her sort of very lucid summary of smart city discourse, the MIT Essential Knowledge book from the same year, I believe, 2020, called Smart Cities, I think. So very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks to all of the presenters so far. This has been a really inspired conference, and I know I've been inspired by the work that I've heard as well. So I am Jermaine Halegwa, and in this talk, I'm not going to offer any answers, I guess, but maybe another layer of things to think about in terms of offering some way to think about gaps in power and places to intervene in the processes of making smart places. So let me just see. So a central thread that weaves together a lot of my research is urging that we need to think more about the places we're creating, as Frederick mentioned in my introduction, through to the dissemination and adoption of ICTs and digital infrastructures particularly, but also the processes and production of place and placemaking alongside the affordances of those structures, and the politics of participation, exclusion, and displacement in the digital places we're creating. So recently, I've been thinking a lot about the edges, what I'm calling the edges of smart city imaginations, or the edges of digital imaginations, and how living at these edges or seams shapes one's relationship to place and feelings of belonging. And I want to talk a bit more about this in the context of smart cities and biased imaginations of the future of connected cities, and how we need to rethink processes of imagining these places. So briefly, actually, how did I get into all of this? Well, I started in Songdo. I became interested in studying smart city development and imaginations while I was working on my dissertation and just starting fieldwork on that dissertation back in 2009. And like everyone else at this conference, I think pretty much, I've been concerned with unpacking the politics of smartness and have contributed to the critiques of power relations and types of places and placemaking processes, exchanges and extractions, ideologies, agencies, and resistance that happens in the service of being and building smart. So 10 years after visiting my first smart city for my dissertation, I wanted to write an introductory book or a primer of sorts on what smart cities are and could be, because I was troubled by the fact that neoliberal, undemocratic, inequitable models that we've been hearing about throughout this conference have dominated smart city development and smart city development imaginations, and that the role of corporate logics in the imagination and design of smart cities continued to deepen. And I think that actually, Jathan, your presentation this morning shows how deep we can go maybe with those imaginations. And I'm still equally troubled every time I hear CIOs or CEOs ward off citizen concerns about surveillance, privacy, social justice issues with perfunctory or elusive remarks that are laden with jargon or rhetoric about the value of big data, objective ways of knowing the city through algorithms, and technological solutions for improved quality of life, which is a sort of vague term when you really think about it. Although people are more aware of these very real concerns regarding technology's institutions and assemblages of data collection and prediction, the warding off of these concerns, or even the creation of silences, as Justine Gagnon, and I think Sophia Malson was on that paper as well, where you talk about silences around data collection in street furniture, are still par for the course. So my aim with this book was that I wanted to introduce people to the rhetoric used to support corporate ideologies, to open informed critiques of this limited vision of smart cities, and to present alternative ways of thinking about data and ICTs in urban space, to provide a primer on this buzzword that sometimes feels so like nefarious and just elusive, and give urban inhabitants maybe, or help urban inhabitants and administrators think about ways to push back and transform smart city efforts, to question this sort of rhetoric of smart cities. And in doing so, I actually synthesized a lot of the work by people who are here at this conference today, as keynote speakers and otherwise. So ultimately, I argue in this book and in my other book as well, that the dreams and aspirations of smart cities are restricted by pre-existing inequities in relationships to place, and that terms like community, placemaking, and participation and engagement, while often used to signal inclusivity, are actually ambiguous enough that they can mask real exclusion. So if we look at the prominent critiques emerging from current scholarship on smart cities, as well as emerging alternate models that we've heard a lot about for building connected cities, then we can see the different shapes that this argument currently takes, as well as what's at stake in trying to attend to these exclusions and silences. So in my book, The Digital City, I presented the concept of replacing the city to investigate how people experience place or create a sense of belonging or familiarity while living in a world of flux, and how digital media use contributes to this. So how people consciously embrace various forms of digital media to create a sense of place for themselves and others. And this is what I've called digital placemaking, or replacing the city. And I think that the concept of replacing can actually help us think through the processes of placemaking in connected cities and imagine how to move beyond neoliberal enactments of smart cities. So replacing is about the doing of digital placemaking, unpacking the processes and poetics of the social production of place through the imaginations and affordances of digital media. So this echoes other feminist scholarship engaging with the smart city. So for example, we heard a lot of it from the keynotes previously, but also Karina Listerborn and Maya Niergaard, your critique of the Copenhagen Solutions Lab, right? I was also Toronto Waterfront Project, but I really liked the part about the Copenhagen Solutions Lab where you argue that, quote, it's in the doing of the smart city that the mechanisms of power, social dynamics, and social difference are played out. End quote. And this is something I want to build on here. So to move through towards socially just and situated, contextually meaningful alternatives to the smart city, people must intervene in the doing, the replacing of the smart city. For example, calls for transparency are often upheld as one strategy or tactic for smart city intervention at the level of the development process. There are a lot of ways that this strategy falls short in the level of code and data and ecosystems, as well as planning and governance. But the value of transparency in a feminist smart city may be extended to consider practices and processes of urban digital placemaking that center transparency about what it feels like to be subject to organizations and assemblages of power, platforms, and spatial relations. Stories and accounts of how people already experience urban digital assemblages and what they need to, or what they know needs to change, and what goals or outcomes would have the most significant impact in personal and collective well-being and thriving local communities. So through more robust and accountable models of listening and communicating experiences of urban digital placemaking and creating more opportunities for community evaluation of smart city projects, the techno-social call for transparency, for example, I mean, we could plug in other values as well, may become more inclusive, intersectional, connect personal and collective lived experiences with broader political structures, and center an ethics of care, critique, accountability, and solidarity. So recapping some of the common attributes of smart cities, I think is very redundant for this crowd, but I want to emphasize again that it's important to realize that smart is a political and ideological prefix that serves a market function. We've heard a lot of that recently, but I think that's worth emphasizing. So smarter is aspirational. It sets goalposts that are always shifting and seem to cry for more data collected, more data processed, shared, more technologies, more surveillance and monitoring, and more processes of extraction, as compared to the services and meaningful connections provided to urban inhabitants. So it creates a hierarchy of cities and constructs spaces for commercial or private enterprises and technology companies to intervene in and control or dictate what a city is and how it is managed. And there's an uneven distribution of smart city benefits, so risks, harms, all of this. So smart cities are internally differentiated or splintered, further privileging already valued socioeconomic hierarchies, populations, and neighborhoods, for example. There are limited ways to assess or evaluate success or impact of smart city initiatives, and to take these evaluations to heart in ways that hold administrators and institutions accountable to communities. This differential valuing also happens with data and ways of knowing the city. that certain qualitative or certain quantitative data about urban life, like water or electricity use, housing prices, health inspection reports, traffic, are measured and valued, while other information about urban life or urban experiences that are difficult to quantitatively measure may not be. So if quantitative measurement of urban activities is how authorities know and manage a city, then they're only going to address and maintain what they can see or what can be translated into code. So there's an argument here for listening to aspects of urban life that can't be quantified or calculated, at least not easily, and learning what these aspects are from the communities who live them. So also redundant for this crowd, but I want to emphasize a couple of things, are to recap the many critiques that we've been hearing over the past couple of days. So importantly, though, I think one critique that has been widely emphasized and should not be ignored is that the types of responsiveness, resilience, and service provision that can be provided through big data processing and smart city tech is limited to what pre-existing institutions and systems of governance and management can support. So current mainstream imaginations of smart cities don't actually revolutionize or transform the institutions and institutionalized practices already in place. So if there are equity or social justice issues embedded in these pre-existing institutional systems, they're not going to change by adding ubiquitous computing opportunities. Instead, you've maintained them and overlaid them with code, which might make matters worse. So furthermore, the dominant models for connected cities that we currently have produce a limited understanding of what digital media could mean for urban life. The technologies we see most often in cities work to connect people with computers or information, not to connect people with each other or with knowledge about the city as place. And here's just one example that I noticed recently out of South Korea. So for example, a glance at least one model of smart city tech is that the priorities for the future of smart cities sort of illustrate through the technologies that they want to implement a doubling down of more of the same. So City Imagine initiatives involve expanding the use of surveillance technologies and the more intense analysis of surveillance imagery such as AI, facial recognition, license plate recognition, and so on, upgrading AI management systems, vague consent and privacy policies, a blockchain wallet app, something to do with the metaverse, expanding big data platforms and sensor systems, and all of this smart tech is aimed to make citizen life more convenient or more useful is the sort of goals that have been articulated here and elsewhere. So overall, the ways that smartness is currently imagined does not encourage the values, agency, inclusivity, solidarity, care, participatory practices that communities routinely say that they want for themselves and their communities and their cities. So what these critiques also highlight is that when imagining beyond smart cities, we need to think about whose interest and agency is recognized and how it's recognized and made meaningful or not. What sort of urban knowledge and production of place is captured and enacted, how, by, and for whom, and to what effect, and who and what forms of knowledge and experience and needs are included and excluded in the production of smart places, and how this exclusion happens, through what mechanisms, institutions, practices, and social relations. So I want to provide a few examples. I think we only really have time for me to get into one, but if you want to talk about this example after, I'm happy to. But I want to talk about a few examples from some of the recent projects I've been working on around broadband access and adoption. And when we think about broadband access and adoption, I want us to think about it as infrastructural foundations for smart places, right? You need broadband access, or you need high-speed networks or networks of some sort in order to connect to a lot of the smart tech that's being suggested. So in some of the projects I've been working on and hope to expand in different ways, I'm currently exploring frictions, tensions, inequities, and failures of communication and listening that happen at the seams of smart city imaginations. And I say edges or seams rather than the underside or shadows, because there's some sort of effort and awareness here that these people and their urban and place-based problems exist. There's an effort to address issues of digital connection, equity, access to resources, and so on, even if it's merely performative or a gesture. And that's the heart of the problem as well, that serving these populations and attending to their needs is superficial or not really done in earnest. So there's a recognition that there's a set of equity issues to be attended to, but there's also a palpable point at which they stop being meaningfully addressed and cared for or cared about by municipalities, ICT and telecom vendors, policymakers, technology task forces, telecom providers, and so on. So there's this theme. There's an edge of attention, inclusion, and care. These moments are often thought of as failures of imagination, and I've used that term as well. But I think that failures, when we think about failures of imagination, we should be thinking about them as failures to imagine all potential stakeholders in a connected city and the plurality of ways that digital media may be needed and used in urban contexts, failures to imagine who has the right to intervene in the socio-technical production of place. But, and this builds on, I think, something that someone else mentioned over the course of the conference, Sarah Elwood and Agnieszka Lisinski's glitch epistemologies. They're also productive moments to explore tactics for replacing the smart city and what tools or re-envisioning of the process of placemaking we need to overcome silences of urban digital experience and understand the plurality of needs in smart city development. So the bottom line here that I want to address is that people are living on the edges or seams of smart city imaginations, as well as the oppressive underbellies. And municipalities need better ways to communicate, listen to, and learn from these experiences, or to be held accountable to communities for doing so. So I think I'll have time for one example, but the image that you're looking at right now, decidedly not urban. It's a picture of a sign that was placed across the street from my house in rural Kansas. And what it was indicating is that right across the street from my house was a series of fiber optic network cables that were capable of carrying high-speed, internet connection, except I looked at it every day knowing that I couldn't upload my lectures for class. I had really crappy internet access. I had to drive 10 minutes to get to the McDonald's parking lot. So this sign taunted me for years, saying the potential for connection is right there, but you live on the edge of it. You live outside of somebody else's digital imagination. You and your household and your neighbors, even though they lived a couple miles away, we're not envisioned as valuable. We're not envisioned as part of any sort of sense of progress or smartness, yet somebody is. Somebody near us is. We're just not there. So it's a very particular sense of frustration to live on the edge or live on the seam of potential connection or digital connection. But I want to show another more urban example of that. So during the summer of 2016, New York City, in partnership with companies like Qualcomm and Google, aimed to transform 7,500 of the city's payphones into like a one-stop shop of digital technology support, all free of charge. So this included a USB charger, a Wi-Fi hotspot, free phone calls, and a web browser. And this might look familiar to people maybe all over the world. Digital kiosks are somewhat ubiquitous. But in 2022, there are only about 1,800 activated kiosks, which is an issue for the city because CityBridge, the consortium that was building these kiosks, is actually in debt to the city for not delivering promised revenue and not delivering the promised number of kiosks. And that's going to become important in a second because CityBridge has been licensed to do some other work for this company, even though they failed to deliver on what they promised. So soon after installation, a city rep said that, quote, "We've heard from New Yorkers who use the links to save data on their mobile plans, call relatives across the country, and get a much needed quick charge," end quote. So the users of these kiosks were very much envisioned as on the go. Tourists, gig workers, delivery drivers and couriers, mobile only or mobile dependent or mobile dominant users, people who move through the streets, but not people who live on the street. And if you read the publicly available reports on the kiosk initiative, this more privileged population, although precarious population, seemed to be the population the city consulted through a participatory planning process. So these on-the-go sort of mobile people. At the same time, the city was wielding this discourse of ameliorating digital divides to justify the smart city project. And interestingly, but not surprisingly, housing insecure people were enthusiastic about these kiosks. So soon reports emerged that people were gathered around these kiosks watching pornography, engaging in public masturbation, playing loud music, complaints about unhoused people or transient populations, housing insecure people hanging out in front of the links for hours. And just 6 weeks after they turned the links on, Link NYC addressed, and the city addressed, perceived misuse of these services by shutting off the web browsers. So no other services were introduced. The web browsing functionality was just taken away. So librarians at public computing labs are very familiar with these uses of public computing. They wouldn't have been a surprise to anybody who's ever worked in a library computing lab, but they weren't consulted. Librarians weren't consulted or listened to in earnest in the development or evaluation of this project, and the unhoused and transient residents weren't imagined as users or agents within smart city initiatives. In fact, the people who found the kiosks and the smart city project the most useful, I guess you could argue, were actually considered the wrong kind of people by the city. And there's several instances of representatives from the city and representatives from Link NYC claiming that these are the wrong types of people for a variety of ways. So instead of earnestly evaluating the project and reaching out to various populations that were served by these kiosks in order to re-envision or co-design the kiosks or redesign digital inclusion efforts to aid these populations, who utilize the full functionality of the kiosks are being amped up as smart poles that utilize dark fiber networks throughout the city to provide 5G connection, which isn't free of charge, you have to pay for it, to sidewalks in boroughs and neighborhoods that had been underserved by broadband for providers as well as unserved by the Link NYC program. So the solution here can't be to award increased access to urban infrastructure and public spaces to the same companies like CityBridge, who built the kiosks and didn't deliver, or consortiums that failed to imagine inclusive digital places and also failed to deliver what they were contracted to do, materially, ideologically, and financially. So this is a failure of imagination, but it's also a failure on a practical level in the way that the city engages with participatory planning, project evaluation, and listening to residents' experiences of urban life and smart city initiatives. So reimagined community-centered processes of listening, evaluation, accountability, and partnerships creates opportunities for alternate imaginations in our failures. So for example, this is sort of my suggestion, but what might be fruitful in this case is the identification and expansion and activation of the dark fiber networks that power those towers, those 5G towers, and the opening up of those networks to organizations, including digital inclusion activists, neighborhood and nonprofit organizations that want to light the fiber networks instead of doubling down on this sort of idea of the towers or 5G. So I'm thinking about this example as a moment to revise processes for how we can intervene in replacing the smart city or doing the smart city that might benefit from accountable processes of communicating and listening to local populations living on the seams of smart city imaginations. So how can we revise processes of doing the smart city to see moments of failure or inadequacy as productive, not only in terms of informing future policy, but in thinking about the tendencies of decontextualized and exclusive imaginations of connection and access to be repeatedly reinscribed in the city, and to undo or to remake these imaginations. So what can we do about this? So some things that I've been thinking about is storytelling, right? So that we need to hear stories of lived experiences from the seams. How does it feel to know how it feels? To think about stories not as a way to sell data, which I've been working sort of in the policy realm a little bit now, and all of the people that I work with are like, we need stories to sell the data. We need to humanize the data through stories, but they don't think about qualitative data. They don't think of the stories as data themselves. And I think that thinking about stories as data is akin to how Black feminist theorists and urban ethnographers Nzeli Azoki interprets Black female urban politics. So public sharing of stories as forms of resistance or tactics that, quote, demystify the ways that the current system fails to meet its own stated ideals, while generating collective energy and resources to address the tacitly supported systemic failures of local institutions and elite power structures. Their politics aim not to destroy, but to reclaim, re-envision, revitalize, and transform, end quote. To tell the truth about urban problems that matter to communities and have these stories be impactful ways that shape how digital connectivity is organized, how place-based discrimination and harm is experienced, and to hold people and systems accountable, and to exert informed agency to intervene in and change these systems. And we need more than storytelling. We need to create better institutionalized and routine municipal systems for actionable communication and listening to the failures of imagination and experiences of these smart city failures, and to reimagine go-to models for participatory planning and participatory project evaluation. We need more tools and partnerships at the municipal level for collective, inclusive reimagining of cities we have and the cities we want. So in this vein, one of my next projects, which is in a very fledgling sort of state right now, is working with municipalities, activists, and neighborhood organizations to develop more inclusive, accountable, and situated and useful participatory planning and participatory project evaluation practices for constructing connected places. So I just want to talk a little bit more about why this intervention might be useful. So a principal a principal critique of smart cities in regard to citizen engagement and participation is that there is none, right? So how do we cultivate and foster public participation in smart city design, maintenance, development, when so many aspects of these plans and socio-technical infrastructures that support them are not publicly available for critique or comment? So planning and partnership often happens of smart city projects, often happens behind closed doors. Vendors sell proprietary technologies that are not meant to be opened up or tinkered with. The very backbone or material foundation of smart cities are black boxed or invisible or intentionally hidden from public view. The geopolitical landscapes for connecting communities is often exclusionary or internally differentiated. And all of these relationships, platforms, and infrastructures have become so entangled with the street and everyday urban activities that to avoid any of these structures or organizations would mean to stop using urban public space altogether. But this list, that I just sort of listed about what's different about smart cities we could see why Lefebvre's right to the city has become almost canonic within smart city scholarship on resistance and agency. When so much of what makes the city smart is not readily available for critique, then how do we exercise our right to the city? What agency do we have to act? But how do we intervene in these systems that we can't entirely see or fully know until they're presented to us fully formed? So critiques of smart cities understand these urban forms in terms of what Virginia Eubanks calls low rights environments, or spaces where there are low expectations of political accountability and transparency, and where people lack agency or obvious gaps in power through which to intervene. But I also think that we need to evaluate this claim further, the claim that there isn't an effort or interest in citizen engagement, because my experience is that there is some. But the methods of participation, citizen input, and public participatory processes for citizen evaluation of smart city projects fall short. So although more ethnographic and qualitative research in this area is needed, corporate and municipal actors do attempt to engage urban residents in smart city discussions in some form. But several U.S. cities, and this is sort of based on the U.S. context, that have launched large-scale smart city initiatives, established meetings, events, online forums to reach citizens about smart city plans, invitations to participate in smart city planning through public information sessions, meetups, or online forums. They're often extended. And if you look at current smart city roadmaps and master plans, you'll notice that they've, for the most part, ventured beyond this right people in the right ways perspective when it comes to citizen engagement, to the point that even like place branding consultants and companies know that you have to have some semblance of inclusion in your plans, right? You have to mention inclusion, participation, listening, let alone do it in some of your smart city development process. However, these opportunities tend to feel largely performative and perfunctory rather than productive, and they only engage select populations. So executives publicly recognize that people are central to vibrant cities, but the ones that I've talked to don't make or know how to make genuine substantive efforts to incorporate a wide range of resident voices. And they often say, like, we lack tools, or we lack know-how, or we lack best practices, and we're relying on, what I see as old models. So although the perspective that there are significant challenges in getting citizens fully engaged in all transformations that take place is a recurring sentiment, municipal leaders in the smart cities realm, at least in the US that I spoke with, or hear speak about these plans, they wanted to find practical, and to them that means cost and time efficient and effective, but meaningful ways to involve citizens in smart city plans, co-design, and use. But they didn't really know how. So I saw that as like a gap that we could fill maybe, or work together to figure out some way to build better participatory evaluation and participatory planning processes among smart city projects. But best practices for participatory planning are commonly critiqued for excluding perspectives representative of larger urban communities and participatory planning outcomes. And these aren't necessarily incorporated into final plans or practices. So what I've observed is that when smart city developers attempt to be inclusive through participatory planning, they produce mismatches between residents and municipalities in terms of the expectations about how processes and collaboration and participation work. So one aspect that there's a mismatch between sort of citizens or urban inhabitants and municipal representatives is through communication and listening. So where, when, how, and available to whom are understandings and imaginations of smart cities expressed. To invest in listening beyond surveillance or superficial expectations would often necessitate a reimagining of processes and practices of doing the city, which planners I've spoken to aren't really interested in investing in or don't have the time to invest in an overhaul of the system. What counts as useful or meaningful knowledge of what a connected city needs to be to serve urban inhabitants, and if members of the public speak openly about the issues that affect them or are meaningful to their everyday urbanism and sense of place, they're often adjusted or brushed aside in favor of other urban issues that are more easily fixed through technological solutions. And participation, so understandings of how participatory planning works, how it should work, and what can be gained from listening to communities. Modes for and of accountability, how residents can hold smart city developers and municipalities accountable to listen to incorporate their experiences, needs, and situated knowledge. And finally, feasibility and fit, of inviting the public into digital placemaking processes or perceived fit of the outcomes of participatory planning within the city's stated goals, their economic allegiances to primary stakeholders, lack of time, resources to engage in productive participatory planning and evaluation processes, and that institutions and organizations' routines cannot accommodate citizen input in the way that citizens feel that they should be. So, but something that I think is understudied and underappreciated in participatory practices are developing institutionalized processes for community evaluation of smart city and digital placemaking projects. It's rare for city governments to provide avenues to evaluate smart city initiatives or to propose or to fund or aid in implementing community-based alternatives based on their current failures of imagination. So as I suggest in smart cities, and as many others have as well, smart city plans need to generate more social or socio-technical solutions that foster collaboration between diverse stakeholders, and in particular, to learn from and engage urban populations that have been historically experienced differential power and agency over urban environments and systems. So we need more citizens, more diverse populations with intimate knowledge about what it feels like to live in cities, to live at the seams or on the edges or the underbelly of someone else's smart city imagination, and more people who care about the equitable access to technology, data, city services, and parts of the conversation that shape what smart cities will become and how to measure their success. In addition, there are significant barriers to entry into smart city conversation. So a certain level of digital and spatial literacy is expected when contributing to or informing digital roadmaps, smart city plans, but to critique and evaluate them should be based on one's lived experience of their costs, harms, and benefits. There are moments where forms and avenues for public participation in urban planning and urban development need to be rethought. So some of the questions I'm currently interested in pursuing now are, how can we create circuits of communication and listening between a wider plurality of stakeholders that centers lived experiences and situated knowledges of urban inhabitants during planning and evaluation and reimagining processes? How can we change not just digital plans and visions for cities, but the processes for envisioning them, as well as the institutional structures and imaginations that need to change along with them? So if you're part of a complex and privatized urban data ecosystem that you can't cognitively map and don't fully understand, how can you critique it? How do you intervene? And as I mentioned, I'm sort of at the very beginning of a practical project where I'm getting ready to talk with a lot of urban planners, but also government officials and neighborhood activists about the participatory planning process, how it's enacted, how they'd like to see it re-envisioned, but also just try and open up spaces where the evaluation of projects and the evaluations of failures of imagination can become these moments where we re-envision the way that we do smart cities, or the way that we think about smart cities. Not surprisingly, though, evaluations of participatory processes tend to show that major barriers to public participation in urban planning are around perceptions of efficacy and impact. So if members of the public are being consulted and that these consultations are exploratory or non-binding, then there's less of a willingness to participate. If they feel that the issues that concern them are not being addressed or heard, they're less likely to feel that they want to participate. They're less likely to feel heard. They're more likely to participate if they know that their input will lead to action that improves and directly affects or is relevant to their lives. So what's important to remember is that while people might lack the digital or spatial literacy or expertise to evaluate a predictive algorithm or right-of-way policies during the proposal stages, people live these relationships and know them intimately. So they're in a unique position to reimagine them. We just don't have the systems to involve them in that municipal sort of level. So smart cities raise new incarnations of recurring fundamental questions about city management, who governs, how, and what aspects of the city are governable. How can cities be planned to create communities, manage growth, and effectively distribute resources and services? But they also raise imperative questions about how we conceive of participation in urban politics and demand new models for citizen empowerment in project evaluation and planning decisions and practices in smart places. So these are practices and politics that have been part of ongoing discussions among urban scholars, practitioners, artists, activists, and they need to continue. And in doing so, start with the idea that it's the processes of doing or replacing the city that need to be reimagined alongside the city itself.